Welcome to Champion Stories. If this is your first time here, subscribe now and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. And now, on to today's story. The afternoon sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Manny Pacquiao's training facility in General Santos City, casting long shadows across the polished wooden floors where countless dreams had been forged into reality. The familiar sounds of leather hitting heavy bags and the rhythmic shuffle of feet on canvas created a symphony that had become the soundtrack of his life. At 45, Manny still moved with the fluid grace that had made him a legend, his hands wrapped and ready for another session that would keep his body sharp and his mind focused. His phone buzzed insistently on the nearby equipment table, cutting through the ambient noise of the gym. The caller ID displayed a name that made him pause mid-punch: Bobby Pacquiao. His younger brother rarely called during training hours, understanding the sacred nature of these moments, when Manny connected with the sport that had lifted their entire family from the depths of poverty. Something in the timing felt different, urgent in a way that made Manny's chest tighten with an inexplicable sense of foreboding. Unwrapping his hands with practiced efficiency, Manny walked toward the phone, his trainers and sparring partners continuing their routines around him. The gym fell into a respectful quiet as they noticed their champion's sudden shift in demeanor. Years of reading the subtle changes in Manny's expression had taught them when to give him space, and this was clearly one of those moments. The phone continued its persistent buzzing as Manny reached for it, his calloused fingers hesitating for just a fraction of a second before accepting the call. What he heard on the other end made his blood run cold. Bobby's voice, usually strong and confident, came through broken and raw with emotion. The sound of his brother crying, truly crying, was something Manny hadn't heard since they were children sleeping on cardboard in their mother's tiny wooden house in Kibawe. The words that followed painted a picture that seemed impossible to comprehend. Bobby, who had always been the brother who handled problems quietly and independently, was describing a situation that had spiraled far beyond his control. The desperation in his voice carried across the phone line like a physical weight, settling heavily on Manny's shoulders as he processed what was being shared with him. Around the gym, the usual sounds of training gradually faded as everyone became aware that something significant was happening. Manny's face had transformed from focused concentration to deep concern, then to something approaching shock. His free hand gripped the edge of the equipment table until his knuckles turned white, his body unconsciously bracing against whatever revelation was coming next. The story Bobby was telling seemed to unfold in layers, each detail more surprising than the last. It wasn't about money. Their family had long since moved beyond the financial struggles that had defined their childhood. This was something deeper, more personal, touching on matters of family honor, responsibility, and the complex web of relationships that comes with being part of a clan that had risen from nothing to international prominence. As Bobby continued speaking, Manny found himself transported back to memories of their shared childhood, when protecting each other was simply what brothers did without question or hesitation. The same instinct that had driven him to drop out of school to help support their family now surged through him, even as his mind struggled to fully grasp the magnitude of what his brother was asking. The training session was forgotten. The carefully planned schedule that governed every aspect of Manny's disciplined life suddenly seemed insignificant compared to the crisis unfolding through his phone. Whatever Bobby needed, whatever had brought him to this point of desperate vulnerability, Manny knew that everything else would have to wait. Manny moved away from the training area and into his private office, closing the door behind him with a soft click that seemed to seal away the outside world. The familiar space, decorated with championship belts and photographs documenting his journey from street fighter to international icon, felt different now, smaller somehow, as if the walls were closing in around the gravity of Bobby's words. His brother's voice continued to pour through the phone, each sentence adding another layer of complexity to a situation that seemed to defy everything Manny thought he knew about his family. The story Bobby was telling centered around their cousin, Miguel, Dionysia's nephew, who had been living quietly in Mindanao for the past several years. Miguel had always been the family member who preferred shadows to spotlights, choosing a simple life as an elementary school teacher in a remote barangay, rather than seeking any connection to the Pacquiao name or fortune. His humility and dedication to educating children in one of the poorest regions of their province had always earned him respect from the extended family, even if his path seemed almost deliberately opposite to the trajectory that had made Manny famous. But something had gone terribly wrong in Miguel's quiet world. Bobby's voice carried the weight of shame and confusion as he explained how their cousin had been accused of something that threatened not only his career and livelihood, but the reputation of everyone who shared their family name. The allegations were serious enough that local news outlets were beginning to pay attention, and in a country where the Pacquiao name carried tremendous influence and responsibility, any scandal involving a family member could quickly spiral into a national conversation. What made Bobby's call even more heartbreaking was the revelation that Miguel had been suffering in silence for months, too proud to ask for help and too overwhelmed to know how to clear his name. The evidence against him appeared damning on the surface, but Bobby was convinced, as was the rest of the family who knew Miguel's character, that there was more to the story than what was being reported. The problem was that Miguel's gentle nature and trusting personality had made him an easy target for someone with more sinister motives. Manny could hear the desperation building in Bobby's voice as he described how their cousin's situation had deteriorated rapidly over the past week. The school board had placed Miguel on indefinite suspension pending the investigation, and the small community that had once embraced him as their dedicated teacher was now divided between those who believed in his innocence and those who had already made up their minds based on rumors and partial information. The financial implications were devastating for someone living on a teacher's modest salary, but what was destroying Miguel emotionally was watching his reputation, built over years of patient service to his students, crumble in a matter of days. Bobby had tried to help with lawyers and private investigators, but the situation required more than money could solve. It needed someone with influence, connections, and the kind of public credibility that could cut through the noise and demand a fair examination of the facts. As Bobby continued explaining the complex web of politics and personal vendettas that seemed to be driving the accusations against Miguel, Manny felt a familiar fire building in his chest, the same burning determination that had carried him through countless fights when the odds seemed impossible. This wasn't about boxing or championships or public image. This was about family and the unbreakable bonds that had held them together through every challenge they had faced since childhood. The afternoon training session was completely forgotten now, replaced by a different kind of preparation that would require all of his experience navigating the complicated intersection of fame, family, and responsibility in the Philippines. The phone call ended with Bobby's promise to send Manny all the documents and newspaper clippings he had collected about Miguel's case, but the silence that followed felt heavier than any opponent Manny had ever faced in the ring. He stood motionless in his office, staring out the window at the familiar landscape of General Santos City, where palm trees swayed gently in the afternoon breeze and children played basketball on outdoor courts, just as he had done decades ago. The normalcy of the scene felt almost surreal against the backdrop of the crisis that was now demanding his immediate attention. Setting the phone down on his desk, Manny's mind began processing the fragments of information Bobby had shared, trying to piece together a clearer picture of how Miguel's life had been turned upside down. The accusations centered around missing funds from a local education program that Miguel had been helping to coordinate, money that was supposed to provide school supplies and meals for children in some of the most impoverished areas of Mindanao. The amount wasn't enormous by the standards of national politics, but in a small community where teachers earned barely enough to support their own families, it represented months of desperately needed resources. What made the situation particularly cruel was how the accusations played into existing prejudices and assumptions about anyone connected to the Pacquiao family. Despite Miguel's deliberate choice to live modestly and avoid any association with his famous relatives, local officials and media outlets were now suggesting that his connection to wealth and fame had somehow corrupted him. The narrative being constructed painted him as someone who had used his family ties to gain access to funds he wasn't entitled to, then exploited his position of trust to steal from the very children he claimed to serve. Manny knew Miguel well enough to understand how devastating these accusations would be for someone who had dedicated his entire adult life to education and community service. His cousin had always been the family member who measured success, not in championship belts or bank accounts, but in the number of students who learned to read under his patient guidance. The thought of Miguel sitting alone in his small apartment, Watching his life's work be reduced to tabloid headlines and whispered gossip stirred something protective and fierce in Manny's chest. The complexity of the situation became even clearer as Manny began to understand the political undercurrents that Bobby had only hinted at during their conversation. Miguel's school was located in an area where local elections were approaching, and several candidates had been looking for ways to demonstrate their commitment to fighting corruption. Her scandal involving someone with Pacquiao connections would provide exactly the kind of high-profile case that ambitious politicians could use to build their reputations as reformers. But there was another layer to the story that made Manny's blood boil with righteous anger. Bobby had mentioned that Miguel's troubles had begun shortly after he had refused to endorse a particular candidate for mayor, someone who had expected automatic support because of his family's supposed influence in the region. The timing was too convenient to be coincidental, and the pattern was sickeningly familiar to anyone who understood how power operated in the complicated landscape of Philippine politics. Manny walked to his desk and opened his laptop, beginning to research the key players in Miguel's situation. Names and faces appeared on his screen as he searched through local news websites and social media profiles, building a mental map of the forces arrayed against his cousin. Each article he read and each photo he studied added another piece to a puzzle that was beginning to reveal a picture of calculated manipulation and strategic character assassination. The champion who had never backed down from any challenge was preparing for a fight that would require every lesson he had learned about strategy, timing, and the importance of protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. Within an hour of ending the call with Bobby, Manny's office had transformed into a makeshift command center. His laptop screen displayed multiple browser tabs containing local news articles, court documents, and social media profiles of the key figures involved in Miguel's case. His assistant, Elena, had arrived with a stack of printed materials that Bobby had emailed, along with contact information for lawyers, journalists, and community leaders who might provide insight into the tangled web of accusations surrounding his cousin. The deeper Manny dug into the details, the more obvious the orchestrated nature of Miguel's persecution became. The primary accuser was a man named Teodoro Villanueva, a local businessman who served on the school board and had been vocal about his political ambitions for months. Villanueva's social media posts revealed a pattern of inflammatory rhetoric about corruption and family dynasties, thinly veiled references that clearly targeted the Pacquiao name without mentioning it directly. His timing in bringing forward the accusations against Miguel coincided perfectly with his announcement of support for mayoral candidate Arsenio Delgado, a man known for building his political career on populist anti-corruption campaigns. What made the situation even more troubling was the discovery of financial records that Bobby had managed to obtain through his connections in the community. The missing funds that Miguel was accused of stealing had been transferred through a series of complex transactions that seemed designed to create confusion rather than facilitate legitimate educational expenses. The paper trail led through multiple accounts and intermediaries, suggesting a level of financial sophistication that was completely inconsistent with Miguel's simple lifestyle and basic banking habits. Manny's research revealed that similar accusations had been leveled against other community leaders in the region who had opposed Delgado's political network. A health clinic administrator who had refused to display campaign materials had been investigated for medical supply irregularities that were later proven false. A cooperative leader who had questioned the allocation of municipal funds had faced trumped-up charges that were quietly dropped after the election cycle ended. The pattern was clear. Anyone who stood in the way of this particular political machine faced systematic destruction of their reputation and livelihood. The most damaging piece of evidence against Miguel came from a witness named Gregorio Santos, a former school maintenance worker who claimed to have seen Miguel accessing accounts and transferring money inappropriately. But Manny's investigation quickly revealed that Santos had been fired from his position 3 months before the alleged incidents took place, making his testimony physically impossible. Even more suspicious was the discovery that Santos had recently purchased a new motorcycle and moved his family to better housing, improvements that seemed unlikely on the salary of an unemployed maintenance worker. As afternoon faded into evening, Manny found himself staring at photographs of Miguel's classroom, images that Bobby had sent to remind him of what was at stake. The small, humble room was decorated with handmade educational posters and student artwork. Worn textbooks were stacked neatly on shelves, and a cracked blackboard showed the remnants of mathematics lessons that would now go unfinished. In one corner stood a small table where Miguel kept snacks for students who came to school hungry, paid for from his own modest salary. The contrast between this simple dedication to education and the calculated cruelty of the accusations against Miguel filled Manny with a cold determination that reminded him of the moments before his most important fights. This wasn't about politics or personal gain. This was about a good man being destroyed by people who saw his decency as a weakness to be exploited. Reaching for his phone, Manny began making the first of what would be many calls that night, mobilizing the resources and connections that fame had given him in service of a fight that was about much more than clearing one man's name. The first call Manny made was to his longtime friend and attorney, Ricardo Montemayor, a man whose reputation for integrity had been forged through decades of fighting for justice in cases that others considered hopeless. Montemayor had represented Manny through various legal matters over the years, but more importantly, he had grown up in the same poverty that had shaped the Pacquiao family's understanding of right and wrong. When Manny explained Miguel's situation, he could hear the familiar fire in his lawyer's voice, the same passion that had driven him to take on corrupt officials and powerful interests throughout his career. Within minutes of ending that conversation, Manny was coordinating with his security team to arrange immediate travel to Mindanao. The decision to go personally to Miguel's community wasn't about publicity or making a statement. It was about looking his cousin in the eye and ensuring that he understood he wasn't facing this nightmare alone. But Manny also knew that his presence would send a message to everyone involved in the conspiracy against Miguel, a message that the Pacquiao family protected its own, regardless of the political consequences. As his team made travel arrangements, Manny continued his research, this time focusing on building a comprehensive picture of the legitimate educational program that Miguel had been coordinating. The initiative, funded through a combination of government allocation and private donations, was designed to provide school supplies, nutritious meals, and basic healthcare services to children in remote barangays where poverty made regular school attendance difficult. Miguel's role had been largely administrative, helping to distribute resources and coordinate with local teachers to ensure that aid reached the families who needed it most. The financial records that Bobby had provided painted a clear picture of Miguel's actual involvement in the program. His access to funds was limited and carefully monitored, with multiple approval processes required for any expenditure over a minimal amount. The sophisticated money transfers that formed the basis of the accusations against him would have required access and authorization codes that Miguel simply didn't possess. The real tragedy was that someone had clearly studied the program's vulnerabilities and exploited them in a way that would make Miguel appear guilty while protecting the actual perpetrators. Manny's investigation also revealed the human cost of the missing funds. 3 rural schools had been forced to cancel their meal programs when the money disappeared, leaving hundreds of children without the one nutritious meal they could count on each day. A medical outreach program that provided basic health care to isolated communities had been suspended indefinitely. School supply distributions that would have equipped entire classrooms with books, pencils, and paper had been cancelled, forcing teachers to continue working with materials so worn that pages fell apart when students tried to read them. The thought of children going hungry, while political operatives manipulated the system for their own gain, filled Manny with a rage that reminded him of his darkest moments in the ring, the times when opponents had tried to intimidate him, or commentators had suggested he didn't belong among the elite fighters of his generation. But this anger was different, more focused and purposeful. It wasn't about personal pride or professional vindication. It was about protecting innocent people who had no voice in the corrupt games being played with their lives. As evening settled over General Santos City, Manny's assistant confirmed his flight arrangements for the following morning. He would travel with a small team that included Montemayor, a private investigator named Dante Villarreal who specialized in financial crimes, and a documentary filmmaker who had offered to record their investigation for potential future use in court proceedings or public awareness campaigns. But before leaving for Mindanao, Manny made one final call of the night to his mother, Dionysia. Their conversation was brief but emotional, as Manny explained Miguel's situation and his plans to intervene personally. Dionysia's response was exactly what he had expected from the woman who had raised him to understand that family loyalty was non-negotiable and that standing up to bullies was always the right choice, regardless of the personal cost. The champion who had conquered the boxing world was preparing for a different kind of fight, one where victory would be measured not in championship belts or prize money, but in the restoration of an innocent man's dignity and the protection of vulnerable children who deserved better than the corruption that was stealing their future. The early morning flight from General Santos City to Cotabato carried Manny through skies that had witnessed countless journeys throughout his life, travels to training camps, championship fights, and family gatherings that marked the milestones of his remarkable career. But this trip felt different from all the others, weighted with a sense of purpose that had nothing to do with personal achievement and everything to do with the bonds that had sustained him through every challenge he had ever faced. As the plane descended through clouds that shrouded the mountains of Mindanao, Manny found himself thinking about the boy he had been when he first left this region, driven by poverty and dreams that seemed impossible to anyone who knew where he came from. A Thai. Montemayor sat beside him, reviewing legal documents and making notes in preparation for their investigation, but Manny's attention was focused on the landscape below. The patchwork of rice fields, small villages and winding rivers looked exactly as he remembered from his childhood, when geography represented not beauty, but the boundaries of a world that seemed designed to keep people like his family trapped in cycles of poverty and powerlessness. The irony wasn't lost on him that he was now returning as someone with the resources and influence to challenge those same systems that had once seemed insurmountable. The drive from the airport to Miguel's community took them through roads that deteriorated progressively as they moved away from the main commercial centers. Manny watched through the vehicle's windows as modern buildings gave way to simple wooden houses, then to structures that barely qualified as permanent shelter. Children played in dusty yards between homes, their laughter carrying the same carefree energy that had sustained him during his own impoverished childhood, when imagination and friendship were the only luxuries available to families struggling to survive. When they finally reached the barangay where Miguel taught, Manny was struck by how much the community resembled the places where he had grown up. The school building was a modest concrete structure with a corrugated metal roof, surrounded by houses that showed the resourcefulness and dignity of people who had learned to create homes from whatever materials they could afford. Laundry hung on lines between coconut palms, and the smell of cooking rice mixed with the earthy scent of recent rain to create an atmosphere that transported Manny back to memories he thought he had left behind decades ago. Miguel's house stood at the end of a narrow dirt path, a small wooden structure that spoke to his deliberate choice to live simply among the people he served. The garden in front showed evidence of careful tending, with vegetables and flowers arranged in neat rows that demonstrated the same attention to detail that had made Miguel an effective teacher. But there were signs of recent neglect, weeds beginning to encroach on the organized spaces, and a general air of abandonment that suggested someone whose normal routines had been disrupted by overwhelming stress. As Manny approached the front door, he could see neighbors watching from their own homes, their expressions mixing curiosity with the wariness that had developed in communities where recent events had created suspicion and division. Some faces showed recognition as they realized who was visiting their embattled teacher, while others displayed the skepticism of people who had learned to be careful about trusting anyone associated with wealth or fame. The moment before knocking on Miguel's door felt suspended in time, heavy with the weight of family responsibility and the knowledge that whatever happened next would determine not just his cousin's future, but the fate of an entire community that had been caught in the crossfire of political ambition and corruption. Manny's hand reached toward the weathered wood, carrying with it all the love, determination and protective instinct that had defined his relationship with family throughout his entire life. The door opened slowly, revealing a version of Miguel that shocked Manny to his core. His cousin, normally a man whose energy and optimism had always been infectious among his students and colleagues, appeared to have aged years in the span of weeks. His clothes hung loosely on a frame that had clearly lost weight from stress and sleepless nights, and his eyes carried the hollow look of someone who had been fighting a battle alone for too long. The sight of Manny standing on his doorstep seemed to overwhelm Miguel completely. And for a moment he simply stared, as if he couldn't quite believe that help had actually arrived. The embrace that followed contained years of shared memories and unspoken understanding about what family meant in their culture. Manny could feel his cousin's shoulders shaking with emotion, the physical release of someone who had been carrying an impossible burden without anyone to share the weight. Miguel's small living room bore the evidence of his ordeal, legal documents scattered across a table that normally held lesson plans, newspaper clippings with damaging headlines stacked beside student papers that would never be graded, and a phone that had clearly been ringing constantly with calls from reporters, investigators, and community members demanding answers he didn't have. As they sat together in the modest space that Miguel called home, Manny began to understand the full scope of what his cousin had endured. The isolation had been the worst part, watching friends and colleagues distance themselves as the accusations spread through the community like wildfire. Parents who had once sought Miguel's advice about their children's education now crossed the street to avoid encountering him. Fellow teachers, fearful for their own positions, had stopped inviting him to their monthly meetings, where they shared resources and teaching strategies. The financial pressure had become crushing as well. Miguel's suspension from teaching meant no salary, but the legal bills continued mounting as he tried to defend himself against charges that seemed to multiply each week. He had been forced to sell his motorcycle, the one luxury he had allowed himself after years of saving, just to pay for basic legal representation. His small savings account, accumulated through years of careful budgeting on a teacher's salary, had been depleted within the first month of his ordeal. What devastated Miguel most was seeing how the scandal had affected his students. The children he had taught for years looked at him with confusion when they encountered him in the community, unsure whether their beloved teacher was truly the villain the adults were discussing in hushed conversations. Several parents had forbidden their children from speaking to him, cutting off relationships that had been built through years of patient mentoring and genuine care. The knowledge that his reputation was poisoning the trust between him and the children he had dedicated his life to serving was slowly destroying Miguel's spirit. Ati Montemayor spread his legal documents across Miguel's small dining table, creating an organized workspace where they could begin planning their counterattack against the forces arrayed against them. The evidence that Manny's team had already gathered painted a clear picture of orchestrated persecution, but they needed Miguel's detailed knowledge of the educational program and its participants to build an airtight case that would not only clear his name, but expose the real perpetrators. As the afternoon wore on, Miguel's demeanor began to change subtly. The presence of family, combined with the evident expertise and determination of Manny's legal team, was slowly rekindling something that had been nearly extinguished by weeks of isolation and despair. For the first time since the accusations had begun, Miguel was remembering what it felt like to have allies in a fight that had seemed hopeless when he was facing it alone. The transformation wasn't dramatic, but Manny could see his cousin beginning to sit straighter, speak more clearly, and engage with the strategic planning process that would be necessary to reclaim his life and reputation. The teacher who had always fought for his students was finally ready to fight for himself. 3 days after Manny's arrival in the community, the entire dynamic of Miguel's case had begun to shift in ways that surprised even the most optimistic members of their legal team. The presence of the boxing legend had initially created a media storm that threatened to complicate an already difficult situation, but Ati Montemayor's strategic handling of press inquiries had transformed the attention into an asset rather than a liability. National news outlets that had previously ignored the story of a small-town teacher were now investigating the broader patterns of corruption that Miguel's case represented. The breakthrough came when private investigator Dante Villarreal successfully tracked down Corazon Mercado, a former bookkeeper for the educational program who had mysteriously resigned just days before the missing funds were discovered. Corazon had been living in fear since leaving her position, knowing that she possessed information that could expose the real perpetrators, but terrified of the consequences of speaking out against powerful political figures. Manny's reputation for protecting those who helped him, combined with guarantees of legal protection and financial security, finally convinced her to share what she had witnessed. Her testimony revealed a sophisticated embezzlement scheme that had been operating for months before Miguel was framed for the crime. Teodoro Villanueva had been systematically redirecting educational funds through a network of shell companies controlled by associates of mayoral candidate Arsenio Delgado. The money was being used to finance campaign activities while creating the appearance of legitimate educational expenses. Miguel's refusal to endorse Delgado had made him a liability who needed to be eliminated, and his access to program accounts made him a perfect scapegoat for crimes he had no knowledge of committing. The evidence Corazon provided included bank records, email communications, and photographs of documents that definitively proved Miguel's innocence while implicating the actual criminals. More importantly, her revelations connected Miguel's case to similar schemes affecting other communities throughout the region, suggesting a pattern of systematic corruption that extended far beyond local politics into national concerns about election financing and educational fund management. As word of the new evidence began to spread through the community, Miguel experienced a transformation that reminded Manny of his own journey from poverty to championship. Neighbors who had avoided him for weeks began stopping by his house to offer support and apologize for doubting his character. Parents brought their children to visit, allowing relationships that had been severed by scandal to begin healing. Fellow teachers reached out to discuss plans for Miguel's return to the classroom and to share their own concerns about political pressures they had faced. The school where Miguel taught became a gathering place for community members who wanted to show their support for their vindicated teacher. Students created handmade banners welcoming him back, while parents organized cleaning and maintenance activities to prepare his classroom for his return. The simple wooden building that had stood empty during his suspension was transformed into a symbol of community resilience and the power of truth to overcome orchestrated deception. Manny's final evening in the community was spent at a simple gathering in Miguel's backyard, where neighbors shared food and stories under the same stars that had witnessed generations of struggle and survival in this remote corner of Mindanao. The boxing champion who had conquered the world found himself surrounded by teachers, farmers, and small business owners whose quiet courage in supporting Miguel had been just as heroic as any victory he had achieved in the ring. As preparations began for their return to General Santos City, Manny reflected on how the crisis that had brought him here had ultimately strengthened the bonds that connected his family to their roots. Miguel's ordeal had reminded them all that success and fame meant nothing without the willingness to protect those who couldn't protect themselves, and that the most important victories were often won far from the spotlight, in small communities where justice and family loyalty mattered more than politics or personal gain. Thank you for watching another episode of Champion Stories. If you enjoyed today's story, subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss any of our upcoming inspiring tales about Manny Pacquiao. Share your thoughts in the comments. We read every single one, and many times your ideas inspire our next episode. See you next time.